Emmy, welcome. It is such a pleasure to see you. I am so happy that you've decided to take part in this summit series. Very, very exciting. Now, for those who might not somehow have encountered yourself or your work, how would you introduce yourself?
Well, just as Emmy van Duerzen, who has worked in this field for nearly 50 years and who is a philosopher and a psychologist, but really basically an existential therapist. That's all you need to know, really, for now.
For now, indeed. And so, I mean, how did you find yourself in this world? As you say, you've been doing this for 50 years or so. So how did you find yourself here?
Well, I think it started in my teenage years, really, when I lived in the Netherlands. And the Netherlands were still, even at that time in the early 60s, a country that had been totally, utterly destroyed by the Second World War. And my family had suffered greatly in the Second World War. Family members had been deported or in war camps, or had had their houses bombed to the ground, had become refugees even. And my dad had been hidden for 6 months at the end of the war. All of my family had starved for several months. All they had to eat was flower bulbs, which weren't meant to be eaten at all, but that's all there was, because they had been cut off in The Hague. The west of The Hague had been cut off from any supplies, so there was no heat, no fuel, no food. And all of that had a huge impact on the country I was born into. I grew up in a tiny, tiny flat. It was really just a one-bedroom flat with an extra little box room for the two children. And I lived in that until I was 17. So my thirst for liberation and freedom and space and self-discovery were immense. And my reading led me gradually in the direction of the existential authors, who obviously had grown out of the suffering of the Second World War, mainly in France, but also to some extent in Germany. And so all of that resonated very strongly with me. And when I moved to France to study philosophy when I was 18, it was towards existential phenomenology that I turned, and also towards political philosophy. And so I became very actively involved in those ideas, but also in ideas of around psychoanalysis, had some psychoanalysis myself, and started working in a psychiatric hospital in 1973, where I had a full-time job working with mainly psychotic and autistic people, and doing artwork, doing radio work, doing dancing with them, also starting to do psychodrama with them, and various other forms of creative therapies, and more using my philosophical background to connect with people. And it was really learning to connect at that deep level, at that sort of phenomenological, interior, intimate level, that attracted me. And I realized there were no models for doing that. The closest I could find were the writings of Jaspers and Binswanger at that time, and I studied them quite intensely. But after a while, I became aware of the work of R.D. Laing in England, and through contacts and going to conferences and meeting people, eventually I got invited to come over to the UK in 1977 to work with those people who were trying to do a kind of existential therapy, which turned out not to be as existential as what I had been doing in France, really, especially in the hospital I worked in Saint-Alban, which is the sort of revolutionary hospital in France where they did apply existential thinking to their work. And I worked particularly with a man called Francois Tosquelles, who also, by the way, was the supervisor, as he was mine, was the supervisor of Frantz Fanon, who had also worked at Saint-Alban. So that is something I have in common with him. I'm quite proud of that.
So you say that the way that the people in the UK were starting to introduce existential therapies was quite different and even maybe less existential than what you and what were already doing in France. How do you mean? How would you kind of elaborate on that?
Well, it all depends, of course, what you call existential work and how you define existential. So what I found in London with Ronnie Lang and Joe Burke and Morty Schatzman in the Philadelphia Association and the Arbors Association is that they interpreted existential thinking mainly in terms of criticizing what had happened in people's families. And they thought very much in terms of liberating people both from their families and from psychiatric care. And so they had created the psychotherapeutic communities where people could live without medication and going on their, what they used to call their journey into madness, and basically, find out about themselves the hard way, if you like, but with other people, trained people living amongst them, alongside them, to keep them safe. But the idea was that we were all equal. So that was a really interesting experience. I'm very glad I did that. For a year, I lived in a therapeutic community and worked in a crisis center and had no other place to be. And that was incredibly intense, and I learned an immense amount. But what was missing in all that was a disciplined understanding of the philosophical ideas and an application of those ideas to actually working systematically with people towards a better outcome. It was all about saying no to the pressure and to society, but there was no yes. There was no real engagement with a therapeutic process that wouldn't be, well, at that time, wouldn't be psychoanalytic or behavioristic. We didn't have cognitive therapy yet. And we had a bit of humanistic therapy. So that is where they tended to turn. They turned towards sort of neo-Kleinian ideas or to Lacanian ideas, which is what I had run away from in France. And they were also turning more and more towards humanistic ideas. So Ronnie Lang was really into Groff's ideas about rebirthing by that time. And many people started to look a bit towards Rogerian ideas or Maslowian ideas. But none of that was really about what I wanted to do, which is to apply philosophical thinking to working with people who are distressed. So from that point onwards, which is really from 1978 onwards, when I started teaching in the arbors, and because they realized they needed that philosophy, so I became the person teaching that to their trainees. From that moment on, I realized there wasn't anywhere else to look for. There was nobody who had done this. The closest I could find was really Rollo May, but again, there was no disciplined structure to that. And so I began to do it myself and started teaching this from 1979 onwards, also at Southwest London College counselling courses, which forced me to really make the ideas accessible to people who didn't have a psychological and a philosophical background. And I think that was very good. I had to make it very down to earth. And basically never stopped and imagined more and more what people needed and what hadn't been spoken about and what hadn't been written about. and drawing more and more theory out of my practice with people, which never stopped. I started my training working with people in 1971, but my full-time work in 1973. And as I said, I've been working with people ever since, which will be 50 years next year.
I mean, the contribution that you have made theoretically and practically for this field is obviously really vast, and I hope that we'll be able to touch on some of it during our interview, at least the tip of the iceberg, maybe, whatever that looks like. But I'm as you speak here now, I'm thinking, did you always know within you? Was there something within you that was wanting to make such a massive contribution, or was it curiosity, or how did it get into where it is now?
I never thought about making that contribution. What I was really driven by, if the truth be known, is my own lack of enjoyment of my existence in the first 18 years of my life, and my deep desire to understand why people waged war on each other and destroyed everything in the world, and why people were so beastly with each other, and why we couldn't create a better world in that typical sort of 60s way, the sort of hippie-ish ideas of how can we create a better world together. That's what I was driven by, to improve things and to make a small contribution to that. And then I was thrown into this psychiatric work and felt overwhelmed by what I saw was happening, in how people were failed by the system and how terrible this was. And I realized that my own suffering was petty and small fry by comparison to the terrible, terrible situations I was confronted with and initially felt ill-equipped to deal with. So my eagerness to read more and be trained more and go back to university again and again, getting trained as a psychologist and as a psychotherapist, then doing a doctorate in philosophy. I mean, it was endless to just gather that understanding in order to make some kind of breach in this enormous amount of suffering in the world, that I felt it was my mission to do what I could to lessen in some way. And that was really about wanting to understand and wanting to make meaning in a world that was seemingly absurd and incredibly nihilistic, and to give people and myself some sense of hope and freedom back, where hope was lost in despair and where meaning was lost in a sense of absurdity and meaninglessness. And the more I went on with that, and the more people turned to me who felt the same. And that became a kind of movement, like a snowballing effect, And then when I sometimes looked up, in the process of doing all these things frantically, I'd think, but this is sort of working. I am gathering some kind of movement together. And then I would be amazed to get approached when they started in the 80s, when I saw that Yalom was doing the same sort of thing, and, realizing there were other people also working like that and getting invited to Scandinavia, and people wanting to translate my books in the 80s and 90s, and realizing the eagerness and the thirst for this kind of work and this way of doing things, and realizing that there was this amazing sense of community amongst therapists who knew this is what we needed to spearhead and move forward with. And that's very exhilarating when you're no longer alone doing it, and you realize there are many different centers all around the world with different people doing the same thing in slightly different ways, and you can start learning from each other and improving what you do together, and then feel that there is an appetite for this. It's not just the professionals who want it, but there are many people out there. When they find out about it, they say, why haven't I been told about this earlier? Why didn't I know? You know, there is this movement for understanding of life and how we can do it better. And it makes so much sense, doesn't it? And, you know, that just drives you forward, and it's impossible to stop because you become sort of part of a great big river that is just flowing towards a great ocean somehow.
And that feels right. Like I remember at the beginning you were saying that it was almost this very personal experience before the philosophy reading, which really resonated with you, which woke something up in you. And there is something very alluring. I think that's a very common thing about people's training in different existential ideas, is there's something, nothing else seems to kind of hit that spot in the same way, and that sense of meaning. And that's, like you say, I think you make a great point about the community. Having that community to explore these ideas is so valuable, because they can be very haunting if people explore these existential questions without a community.
Yes, and that's how it was for me, because in the 60s and 70s, there was no such community at all, you know, that had to be created and invented. So for me, it was a very lonely exploration. And really, the resources were often movies and literary resources, because there were people there who understood these things, or even art, you know, the paintings of Van Gogh for me were always shouting out loud about that exploration of ordinary existence in a more colorful way than the way in which human existence was being made boring and gray and, you know, uninteresting by daily existence. And also by movies. In the 60s, I was deeply interested in Polanski's films, for instance, which to me seemed like a complete same exploration of how people were lonely and how they were bamboozled by society, and to try and get away from them. Or theater. I was quite interested in theater in my teenage years, and the plays that really transformed my life were Jean Anouilh's Antigone. And, you know, I used to know that completely by heart, the part of Antigone, and that was like she was speaking the words that I had been feeling but hadn't articulated for myself. And Brecht's play, The Good Man of Sichuan, I got to play that part, which is a woman turning herself into a man in a world where, as a woman, she can't maintain herself as a business person. And that was staggeringly an announcement of the rest of my life, because as a woman, I did become a businesswoman, which is something I wasn't seeking at all. And I did experience this sense of people trying to destroy me and, you know, taking away what I had built up. And I did have to learn to hold myself safe in that world, and find very different resources than I started out with, which weren't just about intellectually understanding things or doing therapy with people in a kind of therapeutic environment, but also about how to actually live in society as it is, and be aware of the political dangers in that society and the societal inequalities and injustices. And that, of course, made my therapy more and more real, because it was more and more about addressing the real issues that had made people uncomfortable in the world, rather than thinking about that as their psychological problems. So more and more, as I became more immersed in the world, my therapy became more existential, more worldly, and more real. And I think people look for that too. It's not just about the intellectual, sensitivity and the depth of it, which is also crucial, that sensitivity and working with vulnerability and being protective, but it is also about courage and strength and facing reality and dealing with problems and having the hope that that can be done and that we can create a different way of doing things.
Speaking there of feeling under attack, I mean, I think it's so many people can relate to that on so many different levels, but I would love if you fancied sharing it. How did you maintain that safety? How did you hold it together when you felt that you were under attack and people were trying to destroy what you had created?
Well, at different stages in my career, in very different ways. And, with hindsight, there's a sort of episodes where I try out different ways of doing it. So sometimes in the beginning, I would become too strident with that, too defensive with that. Sometimes I became bossy about it. But very quickly, I understood that the best way to do it is by creating a group of like-minded people around you and create safety in numbers and create kind of like an oasis in the world, which is like the New School or the Existential Academy or Dilemma Consultancy, where people all believe in those same values and they will stand together in the face of threats to that. But they will find ways of standing against those threats in ways that the people who threaten you are not expecting, as in sticking with truth and with integrity instead of playing the games that one is expected to play in society. And I have found in the long run, you can do that if you have enough numbers and you have enough going.
So, Emmy, for people who have started to kind of get involved with existential ideas, how would you say that they can go on this journey? I think you've already mentioned literature and film and resources like this, but for someone that's like the word existential just is too vast, what would you say to that?
Well, there are lots of little books you could start with. I think Rollo May's books, things like Love and Will and all that, are still a very good way in. I wouldn't send people to read Kierkegaard or Nietzsche straight away, but they might want to read Camus, book on Sisyphus, or maybe Simone de Beauvoir's Ethics of Ambiguity. Those are sort of gentle ways in, or maybe Sartre's novel Nausea, or some Tolstoy or Dostoevsky. And if they like what they're reading, then they might want to go to some more specific existential therapy books. And then, of course, I would suggest they have a look at some of my own. And I would say probably Psychotherapy and the Quest for Happiness would be a good, gentle way in. And maybe Paradox and Passion would be a good way in. And actually, probably my last book, Rising from Existential Crisis, would be very good, because mostly people will get interested because they're going through some kind of crisis or some difficulty. So that is probably a good way in too.
Thank you. Yeah, and I mean, we obviously haven't got the scope in this interview to cover the whole existential spectrum of ideas, but for you to kind of concisely explain it, what is existential? What are people looking for when to understand, oh yes, that's existential? What does existential mean to you?
Yeah, well, existential means of existence. So it's about investigating existence and life itself in terms of its many, many layers and its many different dimensions in a kind of systematic way. And it is originally, when the movement of existentialism happened, as you know, it was really a popularization of existential phenomenology, of that phenomenological way of being systematic about looking at what human consciousness can do when it exists in the world and how it can make sense of what it experiences. So it's about bringing our subjective understanding of the world into a realm where we can also look at that objectively in a kind of qualitative scientific manner. And it's very important to do that and not have this juxtaposition of the sciences which give us knowledge on the one hand, and then the arts on the other hand. We need a discourse that can bring those together, and that is where existential phenomenology comes in. So it is a subjective objectivity and an objective subjectivity, and it is a middle ground for human beings to make sense of their world and this short life we have that is vital, I think, for anybody. And so it's something that needs to be much more widely spread, because children should learn to have this kind of reflection and exploration going on in their lives, so that they don't find themselves falling into the gap or falling themselves off the cliff of their existence. It's a really essential, aware way of being in the world. And far from that being about alienation and nothingness and nihilism and absurdity, those are only the starting point. So it is about accepting to be in doubt, and from doubt to rediscover our capacity for wonder, and from that point begin an exploration, begin a journey that leads us towards a much better understanding of who we are, who we can be, what is possible, what isn't possible, being realistic about the limitations of existence, and therefore also able to see the possibilities of existence that we never realized were there. So it's always about holding those paradoxes, those contradictions, and therefore to extend the territory of our lives and to become much more free in the way in which we can move around in our existence, go backwards into the past, forwards into the future, explore left, right, center, outside and inside. All of those ways of being in the world coming together in a sort of wonderful dance of being alive whilst facing up to the fact that we're also temporal and that we will indeed come to the end of all of this at some point, but also knowing that things will carry on beyond us, so that there is a larger, eternal perspective to our lives that doesn't need to be reserved for religion, that we can also claim back in a secular way, because, you know, that whole realm of what is beyond us is hugely important to how we are going to look upon our daily existence. So it's a very extensive exploration, and we can either do it, you know, in one session, or we can do it lifelong. And I think when people really become engaged with this existential therapeutic exploration, that sets them on a new path which never stops. So it's never just about having therapy, it's about transforming the way you live your life, and occasionally needing the insights of a therapist who has maybe a better understanding than you for a moment, to help you along and to help you go a bit beyond where you may be stuck.
I know you shared at the beginning some of your story, but I'm wondering, do you feel that existential ideas have helped you through difficult times in life?
Constantly. That is how I live my life. It's not just a profession or a theory or something that I speak about or write about. It is something that I have lived and breathed every day of my life. And so, yes, of course, I both use the ideas and apply them and test the ideas against the actual difficulties I have to overcome. And so that stops the ideas being abstract and being facile and makes them woven in with the actual experiences of life. You know, my experiences as a migrant going from the Netherlands to France and changing my language and all of my cultural habits. Being a migrant coming from France to the UK with a third language and feeling like a child again and having to earn my place in that society over many years against the odds. Um, as I said, creating businesses, being in very close relationships with different people and having to adjust and learn about myself in those relationships, being a mother to two children, being a stepmother to two children, being a grandmother to four grandchildren, um, learning about working with professional bodies, learning about working with academic institutions, creating organizations, keeping organizations going through difficult passages and transformations, you name it. And other events too, you know, being involved in having my house flooded from top to bottom twice over, horrible life experiences that have challenged whether the ideas I live by are sufficient when I am faced with catastrophes. And yes, they are sufficient, but sometimes we need to fine tune them and we learn something new. And I guess that is the inspiration for keeping refining the ideas or harvesting new ideas and bringing those back into my writing and into my teaching. So it's constantly organically moving forwards. And of course, learning with others and in discussions and dialogues with colleagues. It's amazing. There's no end to it. You know, the human mind is always capable of weaving more stuff together and understanding things always at a deeper level in more, yes, more text, with more textures, more flavors, more depth than we ever did before.
Would you like to share, I mean, there are many, of course, but would you like to share some of the contributions that you have made of these kind of interweaving of creative ideas?
So, for instance, over the years, I came to develop this four worlds model more and more and more, which became very much about seeing how there are paradoxical tensions at each dimension of those four layers of human existence, and also to describe better how they interact and interweave with each other. There is the model of the emotional compass, which is completely at one with the idea of the spectrum of colors and shows how emotions are naturally related to each other and are naturally an expression of where we are headed in relation to our values, whether we're going towards gaining values or losing values. It's the model of time, which I call the dialectic of time, that Claire and I have written about many times now. It is also about what I call structural existential analysis, which is about the many layers of analyzing carefully where a person is at. So there are many sort of technical bits and pieces that people can take away from my work and apply to their own work. And many people have done so, often without maybe even knowing that they were using things that I had developed. And it's quite interesting to see how these things touch off ideas in other people and come back to you sometimes in different guises. So that is a constant process of these ideas being spread, fertilizing new movements, new ideas, and then coming back again to be looked at from a different angle. So it is an alive and a vital conversation and dialogue with other searchers and other researchers, and also often with clients who come to formulate, new things that were missing from the model maybe, and that they're acutely aware of, and they contribute without even knowing they're doing that.
And another thing that I have done really well, at least from my perspective, is you, I think it's Everyday Mysteries, where you give a kind of history of many different philosophers, and I wonder what it was like for you to kind of create that together, go on that journey.
Well, thank you very much for reminding me of that, because that was really the initial search. How could I translate my understanding of these salient philosophers into, and take from them the juice that could be used in therapeutic work? Because mostly they didn't mean to do that. They didn't mean to create a therapeutic theory, but they were actually doing that. So I was reinterpreting them as if they were all therapists who had understanding of the world to contribute. And of course also these different existential therapists who each tried to do that as well, but were often forgotten. So yes, I think that was uniquely my contribution, although many other people are now doing that. When I first did that, and of course I started doing that when I taught stuff from 78 onwards, and the first book was only in 87, so I'd been teaching it for almost a decade before I actually formulated it all in writing. When I first did that, it was very much against the flow, and when I started talking about that at conferences, people would jeer and laugh and challenge and say incredibly offensive things to me, like, oh, you are a bit of a dreamer if you think philosophy is actually relevant to psychology, or, oh, you're a bit of a maverick, aren't you, Emmy? You think we're talking philosophy. That was in the past, psychology used to be part of philosophy, but we don't do that anymore. We need scientific facts. Or what else has been said to me? Oh yes, the other thing was, this was more in the sort of 90s. People would say, oh, that's very sweet. Your theories are very sweet. They're very feminine, aren't they? You're doing this very soft approach. What we really need is, hard-edged cognitive ideas that have been researched. Oh yeah, and oh, you are a bit of a hippie, aren't you? You live in the 60s, don't you? You're a bit of a relic of the 60s. Yeah, these humanistic psychologies, they were interested in these kinds of airy-fairy ideas, but really we've gone beyond that. So up to the year 2000, I was dismissed often in those kinds of ways, but that doesn't happen so much these days.
I mean, you're reminding me of, I think it was Mick Cooper from the first summit that when we were speaking about the kind of development of existential therapy and philosophies, and like where it's going. Is it on the uprise? Is it on the down? Is it kind of plateaued? Like, and I think he said, oh, ask Emmy. So it reminds me, ask Emmy. I'll ask you, how do you feel about the trajectory of the movement?
Well, I can tell you for sure that it has never felt as powerful as it is now. There have never been as many people who are interested and excited about those ideas. Thank goodness, because the way the world is going, we are going to need this movement. So I think we're only at the very beginning still. We are only seeing the tip of the iceberg for the moment. There is so much under the water that I know the world is waiting to encounter. And when the world falls into more and more crises, Natalie, we are going to need people with calm heads who understand what we've done to ourselves, who see a way beyond it, and who know what humankind is going to need. And we don't need people doing these, much more pedestrian, trivial things. We need people who can think big and who can think about the wider picture and about the future and where we're going and what people need to figure out for themselves. So I have no doubt. I think it's only after I die that these things will really come into their own. I have no fear at all that, for whatever time I have left, 10 years, 15 years, I don't know, for the duration of the rest of my life, there will be a huge need and it will continue growing. But as I said, I think only in 40, 50 years will there really be an explosion of this way of approaching the problems in the world, because it will be the only thing that can save us in the future.
And for people who hear that and feel inspired and want to help it grow, how can they help it grow?
Well, just do what I've been doing, grow your own little garden and start harvesting it and start passing it on to people and teach people how to harvest these things and how to basically not give up and carry on with it, no matter what you encounter. One more remark about that, which is this spiritual dimension that we allow for, which is so important, because in future, when the planet, is really burning and there's migration all across the world, we cannot afford to have wars everywhere, and we cannot afford to have religious wars everywhere. So we need a way of working that takes into account human values, ethical ways of being, and an understanding of each other's values, whilst not being dogmatic, whilst being aware that each may believe their own things about the world, but that all of us can meet together in the center ground where we understand how the basic requirements of being human and being good to each other are the same all around the world and for all of us. And I think to dare to know that any therapy that misses out on those kinds of values, about truth and integrity and love and friendship and, I don't know, a search for good living, basically, the existential search, without those values, we do not stand a chance of solving the real problems in the world.
And that makes me think about something that I had contemplated asking you earlier, and you've reminded me to ask you here. What has it been like for you you know, you said before we went kind of back in time, and you were saying, well, yeah, back then there wasn't this cognitive therapy, which is obviously so you know, taken over so much because of its evidence base.
Yeah.
So what has it been like for you to watch that grow and take over, and it's all about, you know, this short-term cognitive and
It's been
maybe
wonderful.
thinking?
It's
Yeah.
been wonderful because when I was training as a psychotherapist, it was all taken over by psychoanalytic ideas, which, as you know, were highly interpretive and were based on fantasies, really, about how human beings operate and function, and the imposition of ideas on people that were often unwelcome to them and counterproductive for them. So that wasn't a good model at all. Much as we've learned a lot from the psychoanalytic explorations, and we mustn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, it was a kind of autocratic system that wasn't helping people as much as we can help people. And on the other hand, we had the behavioristic approach, which was really very primitive in its insistence on teaching people things in a scientific way, which meant in a really cold and lacking in understanding way, as it were. So when the humanistic trend and the cognitive trend grew, I was very pleased about that. That was very encouraging because A, it showed that people were evolving in their understanding on how to help people. And B, there was cross-fertilization. So as existential therapists, we learned a lot from, you know, the basic ideas of Rogerian therapy and being systematic about things. And we learned a lot from cognitive behavioral ideas and, you know, looking at how people sometimes just feel bad because they have certain ideas about the world. All of that is sort of valid from an existential perspective. We can include lots of CBT, and CBT can go in a more existential direction, and we can include a lot of humanistic and integrative ideas. All of that actually comes together, and it's nothing to be afraid of. We need to know about all of it.
Very, very inspiring. And what is I'm thinking is, I've got kind of young clients and I've got cousins who are currently studying their GCSEs and A-level psychology, and this now this kind of standard textbook is that you get your psychoanalytic, you get your behavior, you get your development, you get your CBT cognitive, and so one day, like you say, hopefully we will find the existential as part of the kind of foundation.
Absolutely. Well, most trainings in psychotherapy and counseling do include existential therapy in the curriculum. So that is revolutionary as far as I'm concerned. When I first started teaching existential counseling to counselors, they were like, what? What does that mean? And nobody heard about it at all. So to see it spreading so widely is very gratifying. I have no doubt that it will go further before too long. Maybe within a decade, people will teach these things at A levels too.
Fantastic. We will watch this space and see what happens. Now, before we close, Emmy, and thank you so much for coming along and sharing everything that you have, was there anything else that you wanted to add before we come to a close?
No, just to say, lovely initiative. You're doing your bit to spread the ideas. So congratulations on doing that, and keep going. Don't get discouraged. I think existential courage should always be very much at the heart of everything we do, because, you know, it's about motivation to believe in what we do and to know that the world needs some of these ideas and needs this understanding. So don't let yourself be waylaid or discouraged, but keep going. And I'm saying that to anybody who's watching. keep the good work up. We need as many as possible doing this instead of despairing about what is going on in the world, and making it a better place together. And that's, at the end of the day, what it is all about.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Emmy.
Pleasure. Thank you, Natalie.